Have you ever noticed how someone who claims they don't need anyone will suddenly become the most needy person in the room, but only when you're about to walk away? The subtle way avoidants test if you'll abandon them is perhaps one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human relationships, yet it governs countless interactions we have every single day. Picture this scenario. Someone maintains perfect emotional distance for months, perhaps years, carefully constructing walls higher than the Tower of London, only to reveal sudden vulnerability the moment you show signs of moving on with your life. This isn't coincidence. This is psychology in its most raw, unfiltered form. The human mind, particularly one shaped by avoidant attachment patterns, operates like a chess grandmaster playing 20 moves ahead, except the game being played is emotional survival. When someone has learned that closeness equals potential pain, they develop what can only be described as a sophisticated early warning system. Every interaction becomes a data point, every conversation a reconnaissance mission designed to answer one burning question. Will you stay, or will you eventually leave like everyone else did? What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how it masquerades as indifference. The very person who seems least concerned about your presence is often the one monitoring your every move with microscopic precision. They're not looking for signs that you care, though that's what most people assume. They're looking for signs that you don't care enough to stay when things get difficult. It's the difference between hoping for the best and preparing for the inevitable worst. This testing behavior emerges from what psychologists call the illusion of control meeting negativity bias in perfect, destructive harmony. The illusion of control convinces someone that if they can predict your departure, they can somehow manage the pain of it. Negativity bias ensures they'll focus on every micro-expression, every delayed text response, every slight change in tone as evidence supporting their core belief that abandonment is not a matter of if, but when. Together, these psychological mechanisms create a person who simultaneously pushes you away and desperately needs to know you won't go. Understanding this dynamic isn't just about relationships. It's about recognizing one of the most fundamental human fears playing out in real time. The fear of being truly known and then rejected creates behavior patterns that seem contradictory but are actually perfectly logical when viewed through the lens of emotional self-preservation. Today, we'll explore how these tests manifest, why they happen, and most importantly, how to navigate them with both wisdom and compassion. Consider the story of two colleagues, Marcus and Sophia. Marcus had built his entire professional identity around being the person who needed nothing from anyone, brilliant, efficient, self-contained. He worked late, not because he loved the job, but because an empty office meant no one could disappoint him. Sophia, new to the team, made the mistake of being genuinely kind. She brought coffee without being asked, remembered details about his projects, and worse yet, seemed to actually enjoy his company. For months, Marcus treated her kindness like a fascinating but ultimately temporary phenomenon. He was polite, professional, but maintained careful distance. Then something shifted. Sophia mentioned casually that she'd been offered a position with another company. Nothing was decided, she said, just exploring options. That night, Marcus found himself replaying the conversation, analyzing her tone, searching for signs he'd somehow missed. The next day, Marcus arrived at work, carrying 2 cups of coffee. When Sophia looked surprised, he shrugged and said he'd bought too much. Over the following weeks, he began asking about her weekend plans, sharing small frustrations about difficult clients, even suggesting they grab lunch to discuss a project that could have been handled over email. Sophia, delighted by this apparent breakthrough, began to hope they were becoming genuine friends. Then, just as suddenly as it began, Marcus withdrew. He became shorter in conversations, declined lunch invitations, and returned to his previous pattern of polite distance. Confused and hurt, Sophia assumed she'd somehow offended him. She began second-guessing their interactions, wondering if she'd misread his friendliness. The job offer from the other company suddenly seemed more appealing. What Sophia didn't realize was that Marcus had been conducting an elaborate unconscious experiment. By temporarily opening up, he was testing whether increased closeness would make her more likely to leave. When she didn't immediately reassure him about staying, when she continued to mention the other opportunity, his avoidant system interpreted this as confirmation of his worst fear. The withdrawal wasn't rejection of Sophia personally, it was Marcus attempting to regain control of an emotional situation that felt increasingly dangerous. The tragic irony, of course, was that Marcus's testing behavior created the exact outcome he feared most. His withdrawal pushed Sophia toward the very decision he was trying to prevent. She accepted the other position, leaving Marcus to feel vindicated in his belief that people always leave, never recognizing his own role in engineering that departure. This story illustrates the devastating cycle that avoidant testing creates. The test itself becomes the catalyst for the abandonment being feared, yet the pattern continues because it provides the illusion of control. Marcus could tell himself he saw it coming, that he was smart to pull back when he did, rather than face the more terrifying truth, that his fear of abandonment had created the abandonment he experienced. Understanding this dynamic requires recognizing that avoidant testing isn't really about the other person at all. It's about managing internal anxiety through external control. The person being tested is simply a player in a drama that was written long before they entered the scene, based on scripts learned in childhood about love, loss, and the inherent unreliability of human connection. When you recognize that someone is testing whether you'll abandon them, your first instinct might be to provide overwhelming reassurance. This approach, while well-intentioned, often backfires spectacularly. Remember, the person doing the testing has an unconscious investment in proving that abandonment is inevitable. Too much reassurance too quickly can feel inauthentic or worse, like evidence that you're trying to manipulate them into dropping their guard. Instead, the most effective approach is consistency over intensity. Think of it like training a particularly skittish horse. Sudden movements, even well-meaning ones, will send them bolting, but patient, predictable behavior gradually builds trust. When someone tests you by withdrawing, resist the urge to chase. When they test you by creating conflict, avoid taking the bait while also not shutting down completely. The goal is to demonstrate through actions, not words, that your presence isn't contingent on their performance. This means responding to their withdrawal with gentle persistence rather than dramatic gestures. If someone like Marcus suddenly becomes distant after a period of closeness, continue offering the same level of kindness you always have. Don't increase it in response to their testing, but don't decrease it either. Send the same good morning text you always send. Offer the same invitation to lunch you would normally extend. The message you're conveying through this consistency is powerful. Your availability isn't dependent on their mood, their receptiveness, or their behavior. The reasoning behind this approach lies in how the avoidant attachment system processes information. These individuals have learned to associate inconsistency with danger. When someone is overly accommodating one day and frustrated the next, it confirms their belief that relationships are inherently unstable. But when someone maintains the same level of care regardless of how they're received, it begins to challenge that core assumption. Equally important is learning to recognize the testing behavior for what it is, rather than taking it personally. When someone suddenly becomes critical, starts arguments over minor issues, or begins highlighting all your flaws, they're not necessarily expressing how they really feel about you. They're often unconsciously trying to see if you'll stick around when they're not at their most lovable. Like Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl, who would often sabotage her own relationships just as they became serious. People with avoidant tendencies sometimes create chaos to test whether others will stay through difficulty. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or mistreatment. There's a significant difference between someone testing your commitment through difficult behavior and someone being genuinely harmful. The key distinction lies in the pattern and the underlying intention. Testing behavior typically comes in waves, often triggered by increasing closeness or external stresses. It's temporary, even if it feels intense in the moment. Genuinely harmful behavior, on the other hand, tends to be more consistent and often escalates over time. Another crucial aspect of navigating these dynamics is maintaining your own emotional equilibrium. People with avoidant tendencies are often highly sensitive to others' emotional states, even when they pretend not to be. If you become anxious, pushy, or dramatic in response to their testing, you're inadvertently confirming their belief that relationships are overwhelming and complicated. Instead, cultivate what might be called emotional steadiness. This doesn't mean being emotionless, but rather maintaining a sense of centeredness regardless of their behavior. Think about how Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You becomes obsessed with managing and controlling his relationships through constant surveillance and analysis. While his methods are obviously extreme and unhealthy, the underlying anxiety about abandonment and the need to control outcomes is similar to what drives avoidant testing, just expressed differently. The person testing you may not be stalking your social media, but they're likely analyzing your responses just as intensely, looking for signs of your true intentions. This is where understanding the negativity bias becomes crucial. The human brain is wired to pay more attention to potential threats than to positive experiences. For someone with avoidant attachment patterns, this bias is amplified. They'll remember the one time you seemed irritated far more clearly than the 50 times you were patient and kind. Knowing this, you can adjust your expectations accordingly. Progress in these relationships is measured differently than in others. Instead of looking for dramatic breakthroughs, look for small signs of increasing comfort and trust. One practical strategy is what might be called the lighthouse approach. Like a lighthouse, you maintain a steady, reliable presence without chasing after ships in the storm. You're consistently available, consistently kind, but you don't exhaust yourself trying to rescue someone who hasn't asked to be saved. This approach respects their autonomy while demonstrating your reliability. The lighthouse doesn't take it personally when ships don't immediately head toward shore. It simply continues to shine, trusting that its consistency will eventually be recognized as safety rather than threat. Similarly, when someone tests whether you'll abandon them, your job isn't to convince them of your intentions through arguments or explanations. Your job is to demonstrate your intentions through sustained, reliable behavior over time. Understanding that these tests are ultimately about fear rather than rejection can transform how you respond to them. When someone like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris finds herself caught between her feelings for Gabriel and her fear of getting hurt, she often creates distance through focusing on work or other relationships. This isn't because she doesn't care, it's because she cares too much and doesn't trust that caring to be safe. The testing behavior is ultimately a cry for emotional safety disguised as indifference. The person engaging in it desperately wants to be proven wrong about their assumptions regarding abandonment, but they need that proof to come in a form they can trust. Grand gestures and dramatic declarations of commitment often feel manipulative to someone who has learned to be suspicious of intensity, but quiet consistency, patient presence, and reliable care can gradually create the safety they're seeking. Recognizing the subtle ways avoidants test if you'll abandon them isn't just about understanding others. It's about understanding the fundamental human need for security in attachment. Every person, regardless of their attachment style, carries some version of this fear. The difference lies in how that fear is expressed and managed. What we've explored today reveals something profound about human nature, that our greatest fears often drive us to create the very outcomes we're trying to avoid. Marcus's fear of abandonment led him to behaviors that pushed Sophia away. Sophia's confusion about his mixed signals made her more receptive to other opportunities. Neither person intended to hurt the other, yet both ended up wounded by patterns that existed long before they met. The solution isn't to eliminate these fears, which are often rooted in early experiences of loss or inconsistent care. Instead, the solution lies in developing awareness of how these fears manifest and learning to respond to them with wisdom rather than reactivity. When you understand that someone's withdrawal might be a test rather than rejection, you can respond with patience instead of panic. When you recognize that their criticism might be fear disguised as fault-finding, you can maintain your emotional center instead of becoming defensive. This understanding requires tremendous compassion, both for others and for yourself. If you recognize avoidant testing patterns in your own behavior, remember that these developed as survival mechanisms in situations where love felt dangerous or unreliable. There's no shame in having learned to protect yourself. The question now is whether those protective mechanisms still serve you, or whether they've begun to limit your capacity for the very connection you ultimately desire. The path forward involves gradual risk-taking, both for those who test and those being tested. For the person with avoidant tendencies, this means slowly allowing others to matter without immediately looking for evidence that they'll leave. For those being tested, this means maintaining care and presence without losing yourself in someone else's fear-based patterns. Moving forward, pay attention to the testing dynamics in your own relationships. Notice when someone's behavior seems designed to push you away just as you're getting closer. Instead of taking it personally, consider what fear might be driving that behavior. Respond with the steady consistency that builds trust over time, but don't sacrifice your own well-being in the process. Remember that healing these patterns takes time, patience, and often professional support. The goal isn't to fix anyone or to prove your worthiness through enduring difficult behavior. The goal is to create relationships built on genuine safety and mutual respect, where testing becomes unnecessary because trust has been established through consistent, caring action over time. The most profound gift you can offer someone afraid of abandonment is the security of knowing that your care for them isn't contingent on their perfection, their availability, or their ability to meet your needs. In a world where so much feels temporary and conditional, becoming someone who offers genuine reliability is both a radical act and a deeply healing one.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.